Hello again, this is Jeff Scott, your instructor for 152, 145 Advanced Java Programming for the fall 2015 semester at Black Hawk Technical College. I'm now going to go over the PowerPoint presentations for Chapter 12, which is our GUI Applications Part 2. Alright, we have a little bit more to say about that once we get done with this lecture. So, we're looking at this chapter is basically all on GUI components. Text field, lists, combo boxes, labels, buttons, mnemonics, tooltips, menus, etc. If you create yourself a text field, which remember is like a text box, it has a set editable property, which is a Boolean. If you do the set editable, if you set it to false, that makes your text field a read-only text field if you want to do that. All right. Lists, well, as it says, a list is a component that displays a list of items. So you set it up as an array, something like this. Then you say JList, give it a name, equals new JList, and you basically drop that in there. You drop your array in there, and that creates the equivalent of a list box, basically. When you set up a JList, you can set it up with single selection mode, which means that you can only select one item from the list. You can have single interval selection mode, where you can select multiple items, but they must be contiguous. Or you can have multiple interval selection mode, where you can select non-contiguous items, and that's the default. So there's one at a time, there's single interval, and there's multiple interval. As it says, when you work with this, there is a method that's called set selection mode, so you can set it to any one of these three, and they're the three we just told you. You'll notice that after the dot, that's all in caps because these are constants. When an item in a JList object is selected, it generates a list selection event. So you have to create a list selection listener. The list selection listener must implement the list selection listener interface, and it has something in it called value change. So you must create that method that will handle each time you click something different in your JList. All right, do whatever you're going to do with it, be it that you're going to print it out or whatever. So when the JList component generates an event, it automatically executes the value change method, and it passes the event object as the argument. Again, as we mentioned before, we'll talk about these and we'll look at some coded examples in the next lecture. When you retrieve selected list items, you can use getSelectedValue or getSelectedIndex. If you choose getSelectedIndex, again, just like with what we talked about with other languages, it starts with 0. So the first element is the 0th element. If the list is empty, it should return -1. So index gives you the location, whereas value gives you the actual value that's in there. All right, and as it says, the return value must be cast to a string, and if no item is selected, the method will return null. Pretty much what I just told you with a getSelectedIndex. So again, that would be element 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So as it says there, you could use the code that's shown down below there to determine whether or not an item was indeed selected. Because if it's not equal to -1, then it must be 0 through 6. It must be one of them or multiple, depending on how you've got it set up. Sometimes it might be a little nice to put a border around it, all right, just so that it stands out. You can see what goes with what. So you can see right here we set a border around this, and it calls the createLineBorder method, which is part of the border factory class. And it says I want a 1 pixel black border. You could use any of those 13 colors that we talked about in the last chapter, and there really are other ones that you can use also. By default, as it says, a list component is large enough to display all of its items, but what if you've got more than a whole page full? Most GUI apps display a scroll bar list when you've got a large number of items. List components do not automatically display a scroll bar, but you can add one. As it says, to display a scroll bar on a list component, you set the number of rows that you want to make visible at any time. You create a scroll pane object and add the list component to it. Then you add the scroll pane object to the other containers. You can set up a horizontal scroll bar, a vertical scroll bar, or both a horizontal and a vertical scroll bar. So what they're showing here is, this says regardless of how big the list is, we only want to show 3 elements at a time. All right, and here's the scroll pane, which is a member of the JScrollPane class. And as it says, it creates a scroll pane object that will hold that array that has our name list in it. So you create the panel, you add the scroll pane to the panel, all right? As it says, just like you would any other GUI component. When the list is displayed the way that it was set up previously, it'll show 3 items at a time, and it will show scroll bars, because that's what you've asked to have happen. All right. Notice that by default, JList only adds a scroll pane object. So it only adds those scroll bars if they're needed. Okay. You can force them to go in there also if that's indeed, for whatever reason, that's what you want to do. The setListData method is mentioned there, allows the adding of items to an existing JList component. It's like the items.add that we've had in C#. So there's an example. NameList.setListData names in that case. So you can create an empty list by putting nothing in the parens, and then create your string, and then use setListData. There's a lot of different ways that the same thing can be done in here. A list is set to single interval selection by using that same thing that we talked about before. All right. And with single interval, that would mean it would be it must be a contiguous interval. All right. We've already talked about this, the get selected value by default. So if you just call get selected value, it returns the first item in the interval. And get selected list, again, by default, returns the index of the first item that's in the list. If you want to, as it says, to get the entire selected interval, you use the get selected values rather than get selected value method. The get selected indices method returns an array of int values that are indices of all the selected items in the list. Again, you can set it up for multiple, same stuff that we talked about earlier. With multiple, as it says, you hold on to the control key and you can click. They can be contiguous or non-contiguous. Otherwise, it pretty much works the way we just saw with single selection. Here's an example. So you'd select the ones you want, you click Get Selections, and boom, there it is. Combo boxes, as it says, presents the user with a list of items that the user may select from. So with a combo box, by default, it's going to look like this. So if it just shows Bill there, but if you click the down arrow, you'll see Jerry, Greg, Jean, Kirk, Philip, and Susan. Sometimes what you put up here for the first name for element 0 is please select one of the names below or something like that. When an item in a JCombo box is selected, it automatically generates an action event. It's like a button. All right, so it has to implement the action listener, and it needs to have an action performed method, just like a button does. And you might think, well, geez, this is kind of bad. Why don't they all use the same interface? I can't really give you an answer for that. That's just the way that they were set up. With a combo box, again, just like we just saw with a list box, there's get selected item and there's get selected index. They work the same way. The get selected item returns a reference to the item currently selected, and the get selected index, all right, is going to return the index. Here are some examples. Notice there are two types of combo boxes: uneditable, which means you can only select what's from the list, and editable, which is kind of like a text field with a list box underneath it, because you can select things that are in the list, or you can type input into the text box and add new names. So let's say I wanted myself from here, I'm not in there. So if it was set up that it was editable, I'd be able to come in and add my name. As it says there again, an editable combo box appears as a text field with a small button displaying an arrow joining it. So again, you can select an item or type in your own. You're not restricted to the values that appear in the list. So there is an example. Sharon's not in the list. But the idea is if you put in Sharon and you hit enter, typically what you're going to want is that be added to the list. All right, displaying images in labels and buttons. So as it says, most of the labels we've ever worked with display text, but they can display images, they can display text, or they can display both. All right. So what they have in here is they have you create an image that's got a smiley GIF on it, and then they put some text on it too. Okay. Well, again, we're going to go over these in more depth and breadth of coverage when we go through the regular code that's in there, the coded examples. So they create this label here, have a nice day, and notice they've got the image and they make it right justified. So it should say have a nice day in the button, and then off to the right it should have the smiley GIF. Creating a button with an image is similar to creating a label with an image, so you can take a look at that. You can also add an image to an existing button if you want to do that. A mnemonic is a key that you press in combination with the Alt key to quickly access a component. Microsoft is filled with mnemonics. All right, maybe not in here, I'm looking here, but let's see if I bring up Word. So I'm bringing up Word. I'm doing this on purpose here. I'm bringing up Microsoft Word. Or I'm trying to bring up Microsoft Word. All right, I'm double clicking here. I guess they don't have, maybe they don't work with mnemonics anymore, but they always have in the past. All right, here, well, let's find one. All right, I don't want to use file here, but let's go to home. See, the problem is all of this stuff that used to be done with menu options is now pretty much being done graphically. All right, let's see, if I put in I want to bold a word. I mean, and I'm going to try Control B, this Control B word. So can you see what I did there? I did a Control B, and once I did that, I did Control B, I typed in this, and then, oops, don't want to do that. And you can see that the word this is bolded. All right. I used the mnemonic, the Control B. Well, typical mnemonics use an Alt, but the idea is the same. So again, they're sometimes called hotkeys. You assign them using the set mnemonic method. So it's kind of ugly. So notice right here, I'm going to say the exit button is going to have a new button called exit, and then I do a set mnemonic, the key event, VK for virtual key, and then the letter X. So exit will have EXIT, but that exit you see right there will have an underline under it. And what it should mean there is with that X, if you do an Alt X, it'll do the exit. You can also assign mnemonics to radio buttons and checkboxes, and you can see those. All right. And in the book, they show the actual examples. You can also set up tooltips. All right. You do those with mnemonics. What you see on this slide right here is a combination of both a mnemonic, the X underneath the word exit, and a tooltip. The big thing to worry about with these things is you can't go too nuts. All right. In other words, you can put so much stuff in there. You can have a tooltip for everything and a mnemonic for everything, and then it gets very hard. Your screen almost gets too hard to read. File chooser, like a file input or an input dialog that we've had in other languages. So here, this will allow you to open up a file. And notice by default it's files of all types, but you can put filters in there so it only shows certain kinds of files, if indeed that's what you want to or need to do. There's an open dialog and there's a save dialog. And basically, as it says, allow you to browse for an existing file to open or to browse to a location to save a file. For the open dialog, you use the show open dialog. And for the save file dialog, you use the show save file dialog. We'll look at this when we get into some code examples in just a bit. As it says there, you can compare the return value to one of the following constants. So in other words, did they click on the cancel button, did they click on the OK button, or did something wrong happen? With this, as it says right there, you can use the file object's getPath method to get the path and the file name as a string. Sometimes it's not enough to show the name of the file, but you do want to show the entire path to how you got there. There's also a color chooser. You've seen stuff like this where it brings up a color palette. Okay. And notice what it says. If you click the HSB tag, that's hue, saturation, and brightness. The RGB tag is red, green, blue. Okay. There's a color show dialog also. I think with a lot of these, what it does is more than anything else is they're very much similar in nature to things that we've covered in the C# class. So I think when you see these in action, so to speak, when we go over that, it'll make a little bit more sense to you. Here's a menu structure. And you'll notice that by default, when you create a menu, you've got to build the menu piecemeal. And if you don't know what I mean, I'm going to show you in just a second. But where it says menu bar right there, that's the whole bar here. All right? So right now this menu bar contains two options, file and edit. The menu for edit contains copy, cut, paste, sort, autosave, large font, and small font. This sort under edit has a sub-menu with ascending and descending. You'll notice you can have a checkbox menu item and you can have radio button menu items. So you can choose this or not choose it. Here you can choose, once you choose one of them will be chosen all the time, the large or the small font. So those are the components. And when you construct this, you construct it basically out of code. So notice it says using the following classes. I'm not going to read these to you. All right. Rather, I think we're going to be shown an example or somewhat of an example in here. All right. And if we're not shown them here in the slides, we will go over the example. And what I'm going to probably do for the examples, rather than writing a lot of code, I'm just going to bring up the code that the author has provided for us in the chapter, such as the menu window.java. All right. A text area is just like an HTML text area. In other words, it's for multi-line comment. So when you set it up, you have to tell how many rows you want and how many columns you want it to have. It has a get text and a set text method. All right. Get text, basically to grab the text that's there. Set text if you want to set the stuff that's there. All right. We've already talked about scroll panes. Again, by default, they're not displayed until they're needed. You can have horizontal, you can have vertical with all this stuff, or you can have both. And notice the default is always as needed. You can say never if you want to hide the rest of the text. You can say always, even when it's not needed. Notice by default, text areas do not perform line wrapping, so you can call the set line wrap and set it to true, and then it will. And there's two different styles. Notice that it breaks up between characters, so you might end up having something that looks really pretty bad. All right, but if you do it between words, it's going to look a lot nicer. You're going to have the size of your particular columns will vary, but it will always end on a word boundary. Whereas if you do it based on a character boundary, it's probably going to line up more, but it'll look really bad, and it does not automatically, to my knowledge, it does not automatically add hyphens for you either. All right, you can work with fonts in here. The font name, the font style, and the font size. So notice, as it says, Java guarantees that at a minimum, you'll have these fonts that are right here. I'm not going to read them to you. You can see them. The styles you can add to them are plain, bold, and italic. And you can combine the bold and italic together if you want to by using a plus sign. So this would set up brand new. This would say my label, I want to have a new font in here that I want to be serif, bolded 24 point. And again, typically the reason that you're going to jack with that kind of stuff is just because, for effect or whatever. You can set up sliders, either horizontal sliders or vertical sliders. Again, we're going to do something very similar to this vertical slider when we get to chapter 14 and we talk about applets. Slider gives you a range of numeric values. You can set the minimum, you can set the maximum, you can set whatever these ticks are too. Notice here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't know how many, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, etc. I think in both of these. But you can set them up so that each tick is 1 or is 5 or 10 or 100 or whatever you need. All right. Again, there's the orientation for horizontal or vertical, and as I mentioned previously, you can see that those are in capital letters because they are constants. Here's some examples, and we're going to go through these when we go through the text in just a little bit. Notice to handle the change event in a slider, you use a change listener class. Okay? And it must implement change listener, and it must have a method called state changed. All right, so we'll look at the temp converter one in just a bit. Finally, I think this is about the last thing that's discussed in here. Java allows you to work with something that's called a motif, which really means the look and feel of your Java GUI. And when you work with that stuff, as it says, on most systems, the Java default look and feel is called Metal. But there are also classes for Windows, there's classes for Unix, there's classes for Mac, etc. You can also go out and buy different motifs, all right, with this look and feel. You'd have to pay for them typically, but there probably are some that are out there for free also. You change an app's look and feel by calling the UI Manager class's set look and feel method. So here's how you'd set the metal, here's how you'd set the motif, here's how you'd set the windows. There are pictures in the book of what each one of these looks like. Oh, and here they are. All right. That's pretty much it for the chapter, okay? Now what I'm going to do, just so you know, in the what I've decided to do is we'll build an app, and we'll build it, and we'll put menus in it, etc. And everything that we do in that app, everything that we do in there, we'll do by hand. We'll do it by scratch, all right? But there's also a way, and this has changed since the last time I taught the class, but I went online and looked, and I found a set of videos that I'm going to watch, and I don't know yet if I'm going to use them because I don't know how good they are. This says installing Java's window builder, GUI designer plugin. So I'm going to see if I design that, if it's easier to use that. Then they have creating your first GUI project in Eclipse, and I think it's using that plugin. Then they have creating a calculator. That's what this one is. So I'm going to look at these, and if I think they're worthwhile, we'll go over them in class, and that's what we'll be doing shortly.